So today we are joined by Devika Lakhote. Devika is currently pursuing her PhD from the Harris School of Public Policy at University of Chicago. Her research focuses on discrimination and access to public goods faced by disadvantaged groups in urban India. Prior to this, Devika completed her BA in economics at St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, and worked as a research associate at J-PAL. She was also a predoctoral research fellow at the Stanford University's Institute for Economic Policy Research. Thank you for joining us today, Devika. Very excited to
Thanks
hear
for
about
having
what
me.
you would say. Sure. So, as an introduction, we can begin by talking about your career path so far. So, what
Mhm.
led you here, and how or when did you decide that you wanted to be in academia?
I guess it started when I was in undergrad at St. Xavier's. I like you said, I did my bachelor's in economics. And at the time, we got a fairly decent number of opportunities to do research if we wanted to write some short-term papers and things like that, present at the research seminar at Khandala, as you know. And that's, I guess, where I realized that this was something interesting to me. Obviously, I didn't know anything about academia at the time. I just knew that, okay, economics seems interesting and research seems interesting. So that's how it kind of started. And then I found out about J-PAL through some of the seniors, like Nikita Kohli, who was in the third year when I was in my second year, and she was like applying for J-PAL research positions. That's how I found out about it. And then J-PAL came to college for placements, and they gave a talk and they described like the job profile of a research assistant at J-PAL, and that seemed aligned with what I wanted to do. At that point, still I hadn't thought about a PhD or even like what being in academia would mean. I just wanted to get experience as a get experience doing research basically. So I applied to JPAL, and I ended up getting this short term gig with them for 4 months. They had a project that was uh, ending in 4 months. They needed somebody to come in and run uh, a bunch of surveys and do a lot of field work. And it was sort of the fag end of the project, and they wanted somebody to wrap it up. So I thought that was a good opportunity because I was still not sure at the time if I wanted a full-time job or a master's degree after my undergrad. So I took that, and those 4 months were amazing because I moved to Bangalore, and I started doing field work. I had a team of surveyors with me, and we went like to a bunch of villages in Karnataka and conducted surveys and collected data. That was really fun for me. And eventually, instead of going for a master's, I just decided to stay on at JPAL and get a full-time research position. So that's how I ended up working in Arun Chandrasekhar's lab at J-PAL, and they used to study social networks and the effect of your position in the social networks on your economic outcomes. That was sort of the broad research area. Yeah, so I ended up working there for about a year or so. That's when I kind of realized that, okay, this is an interesting uh, research career I could have, where I could do a PhD and then enter academia as a researcher. And I also spent a lot of time working with Arun Chandrasekhar, who is a who is a professor at Stanford, and that, I mean, he was the PI, or the principal investigator as we call it, at the lab. And just talking to him and working on his project sort of made me interested in like development econ type of research. So after my stint at JPAL, I he actually I mean, I'll give him like 100% credit for this. He told me that he had a position at Stanford for a full-time like RA. So and he asked me to apply for that position because he thought that would be a good like stepping stone to a PhD. And I had already talked to him about wanting to do a PhD. My plan actually, I mean, before this whole thing, the Stanford thing happened, I was going to go get a master's in math or like something like that, like applied math, because I mean we can talk about that later, like how having a background in math was really important in order to get into a good PhD program. So that was my plan, but then this thing worked out with Stanford, and so I ended up moving there for a couple of years. I did research with him as his RA and worked on pretty much like all of his projects, doing data analysis and research like experiment design. Basically was able to do all the different parts of a research project over the 2 years, which was really great. And then that's when I applied, like that's when I went through the whole application process for a PhD. And yeah, so then I ended up coming to Harris for my PhD in public policy. And now it's my, and like I'm finishing up my third year now. So that's sort of been the process.
Okay, that's really interesting, and it's nice to hear about your journey, which is a little different from the traditional one where masters is sort of a necessary prerequisite for a
Hmm.
PhD. And maybe we can talk about that a little later in terms of how you managed to get that, and probably if you have any advice for aspiring students as well. But now moving on, I'd like to sort of delve deeper into research as a career, primarily within academia, since that has been your area of expertise. Could you share what are the typical roles and responsibilities of an academic researcher, and what a typical day looks like for you as a research associate at either of your jobs in the past?
Yeah. So the two jobs are kind of different from each other. So I'll start with the first one, which is a field RA job at J-PAL. That involves a lot more. So you can think of the project having two stages, or three stages rather. The first stage is data collection, survey design and data collection. The second stage is once you have the data, you clean it up, you run your analysis and see what's there, what's not there, and all the hypotheses you had, you test them, and then you have a set of results. And then the third stage is writing up the actual paper and trying to get it published, and circulating it amongst your peers, getting feedback, and then reworking it, and submitting it to journals. So those are sort of the three, I would say, stages of the project. And regardless of, I think, pretty much any field of research you're in, but in development econ, especially in this subfield of running field experiments to collect data, that's the three stages. And in the field RA job comes in at the first stage, where you're in charge of data collection. So um, depending on the scale of the project, you will have either a small team of surveyors who are in your team, and or a very large team, depending on how many observations you're planning to collect. And so your day-to-day job really involves starting with survey design and experiment design. So either you're doing like a straight up survey where you're going and just asking people a bunch of questions. That is one part. And the other part is, if you're running an experiment, then there will be some more technical aspects to it, where you need to figure out who's your treatment group, who's your control group, make sure that the randomization is happening very cleanly, making sure that all the sort of econometric requirements are fulfilled and they align with your logistical constraints of collecting data. Like, for example, ideally you would want to say survey, do like randomly select people all across Karnataka and then put them into treatment and control. But obviously you can't do that because people live in villages, and pass information on to each other. And so you can't have treatment and control people in the same village, because they might talk to each other and then your treatment will get contaminated. So then you have to do the treatment at the village level. So everybody in the same village gets the same treatment. And so you need to figure out like how to randomly select villages in order to administer these treatments. So there is all this like back end knowledge you need to have of econometrics to be able to run the survey properly or run the experiment properly. And once you have that, you train a team of surveyors, you go on the field, you test out your surveys, you test out your experiment, see that everything's working properly. Then you sort of launch the main one. So there's a lot of testing time. Sometimes you might spend your entire time at J-PAL just testing an experiment, because it's just that big, and you can't invest so much money into it without knowing if this thing is going to work logistically or not. So sometimes, yeah, projects like just are in like a testing phase for a year. But sometimes you might come in at like the middle stage of the experiment where it's like launching into a full scale thing. So then, everything is set and you need to just implement this massive operation of collecting data properly. So that's really the every day of it. You wake up, you get information from the field, all the surveyors are on the field, you get data from the field, you look at it, you make sure that it's all good. There are all these like battery of checks you can do to make sure that everything's going smoothly. So you use a lot of, I think people use R nowadays, but back in 2015 we were using a lot of Stata. So you just like run all your code on Stata, on the data that's coming in, and check everything's going fine. You check in with your PI, like the professor on the project. Depending on what stage it is at, you might talk to them every day, or sometimes once a week or once in 2 days, whatever, and keeping them updated on how the data collection is going. So that's pretty much that job. And sometimes if you come in at a much later stage in the project where the data has already been collected, then you might end up doing more data analysis work, where you're like running regressions and stuff to see what the results are and if your treatment effects are what you expected. But that, I would say, really depends on the stage of the project that you enter in. So when you're interviewing for a job like that, I think it's important to ask what stage the project is at, just so you have an idea of what kind of job, like what your day-to-day job will look like. And the second job I had, which is the research assistant at Stanford, that I would say is like the second and the third part of the research stage, where the second part is like data analysis, and that takes up most of your time, where you are just running tons and tons of regressions or any other kind of statistical analysis that might be required. So obviously there is the one main hypothesis of the paper, but then there are all these several other robustness checks you have to put in the paper. Sometimes you write up models and you want to simulate the models and have some predictions of the models and then test your data against that. So there are all these different things you look up any economics paper, you'll see the different types of analyses that are required, and all the tables you see in those papers are probably made by an RA sitting at the university. And so you have a lot more contact with the professor at that time, where pretty much every day you're going through the gamut and thinking about what analyses to do and looking at the results, going back to the drawing board, and lots of back and forth. And you'll probably be working on multiple papers at the same time, multiple projects at the same time. So you need to just keep track of all of that. So you spend most of your time writing code to run these analyses. So you need to be really good at using R or Stata, whatever the professor is using, whatever they're comfortable using. And you should have good knowledge of econometrics and statistical analyses using these software. And the third stage is writing the paper, circulating it amongst the peers, and trying to get it published. Obviously, this is more of the professor's job. it varies how much the RA is involved in this process, but usually, especially in the sections of about results and data, the RA can contribute, and that they have the most information about all the different results and all the different data that exists. So you definitely get to either even write up the sections, or sometimes write a sort of report for the professor so they can convert it into a paper, a section in the paper. And you get to see the whole process of them sending it to their peers, or sending it to journals. And when you get responses from journals, either a rejection or a revise and resubmit, so you get to see all of that. And that's really good. Again, I think if you want to eventually be in academia, it's good to see the whole process of from start to end.
So the responsibilities that a researcher has are quite varied, right? I mean, especially if you're involved in the end-to-end process.
Mhm.
So are there different types of opportunities that you might have depending upon which stage you want to be involved in, or is it typical for a research associate to be involved in the overall process, especially at the early stages of their career?
So if you go down this route of like working as an RA for a professor at a university, then they are going to have multiple projects going on which are at different stages of their life, and you will end up working on a bunch of them unless you are hired specifically for one mega project and you only work on that project. That's different. But mostly people hire RAs more generally for their entire research portfolio, and so you end up juggling a bunch of projects at the same time, and they'll be in different stages of their life. So yeah, I think you'll end up doing all this stuff to some extent.
And is
Yeah.
that true even at a more senior level?
uh I would say that, and I don't know what like a researcher. So I mean, I'm talking about RAs who work at universities. They don't stay on for longer than a couple of years because they usually apply for a PhD after 2 years and then try to get into a PhD program. So there's no concept really of a junior and a senior RA
Right,
because
right.
you're just there for 2 years and then you leave. That's typically how that model works. Maybe at an organization like J-PAL, that you people can maybe stay there for longer because not everybody doesn't necessarily want to do a PhD at J-PAL, or organizations like ID Insight, or any of these other data driven organizations. um, Over there, if you're a senior RA, you might take up a little more of a managerial role, more of a leadership role, where you're handling a bunch of junior RAs, or specializing maybe in like a specific type of field, like subfield of research. Does that make sense?
Yes, that sounds right. And what is the typical growth path for somebody who wants to pursue a career in academic research? So, say after their PhD.
Oh, I see. So I'm still figuring that out because I'm still in the middle of my PhD. But from what
Right.
I know, the typical path is that you spend 5 to 6 years doing your PhD, working on your dissertation. And one of the papers in your dissertation, it's called the job market paper. That's the main sort of thing that you get hired on after your PhD. And that's really the paper that defines what your research interests are, and so signals your ability to the potential employers. And you go on the market, that's what they call it, uh, where all the employers jobs are listed. You apply for a bunch of jobs, and they look at your research, they look at your CV, and then they call you for interviews. So these employers can range from universities to nonprofits like World Bank, or think tanks, or econ consulting firms, management consulting firms, tech firms. um, yeah, so I think that's sort of the range of the type of jobs people do. Government jobs, so they all come to this high. It's like a it's pretty centralized. All of them post their jobs in one place, and not in one place, but like a handful of places, and people apply, and then you get called for interviews. You present your job market paper like you would present, a research seminar. Then if they like you, if they like your research, if they think you're a good fit, then you go on to the second round and third round, and then you get hired. So um if you get, most common I would say is the university position, where you get hired as an assistant professor at an econ department or a policy department or something. And then you just go up the ranks, like try to, I think you have to work as an assistant professor for 7 years. Then you get you're up for tenure if you had it, yeah. And then you present all the research you've done in 7 years. You get evaluated, it's like a whole thing. And then the department decides whether to give you tenure or not, which means whether to make your job permanent or not as a professor in their department. That's a big deal. If you get tenure at a good department, that means that the department really wants you and wants you to continue doing research on the things that you like, and continue publishing. That's the most common track. But then there are also obviously these other tracks, like you could work at the World Bank as a researcher. You can work at the Federal Bank, Federal Reserve, I think it's called. And you could work at the tech firm Amazon, Google. They hire a bunch of economists. So yeah, I mean, I would say there's industry jobs, there's government jobs, and then there's academic jobs.
Right, right. And would you have any insights on how the role that a person performs as a researcher can vary depending upon the organization that they're a part of, and how the pay or growth trajectory might vary?
Yeah. So I would say that in academia, which is what we call like all the university jobs, the main goal is to work on your own research agenda, like whatever your questions are, whatever questions you're interested in. You try to publish as much as possible. The goal is, I guess, the first short term goal is to get tenure. It's not very short term because it's 7 years, but that's sort of the first milestone, where you spend all that time just establishing your specific research agenda, and try to do as much work in that as possible, and try to have as many papers that not as many. I don't think it's necessarily about quantity, but just have sort of high quality papers that really get at the questions they're interested in and say something new and unique and cutting edge, right? That's really the goal. And in terms of pay, it's quite varied. I would say an assistant professor and so universities go by rankings a lot, right? So they follow a ranking system that gets updated every few years, where a job at a top ranked university is quote unquote more prestigious than at a lower ranked university. And so the pay varies accordingly. I think if you are at a higher ranked university, you'll get paid maybe more than if you're at a lower ranked university. I don't exactly know the salary numbers, but I would say they would probably be somewhere between 60,000 a year to 110, 120,000 a year for your starting, depending on which department you're in. So it's quite varied. In industry, which is what like we call as the corporates or the tech firms, the goal isn't so much your own research agenda, but the company department, like the research department of the company and what they want. So for example, if you worked at say Google, then they might have some specific uh, research questions they need answered based on all the data that they have. What, maybe it's consumer insights, maybe it's analyzing advertisement data. So there could be a varied number of things. um, or for example, I know Airbnb hires economists to figure out uh, like pricing of their rentals, those kinds of things. So there are a lot of interesting jobs there, but I would say those are more pretty much aligned with the corporate, like the company's research agenda, not so much your own, unless you are like a very senior economist who already has a university position, who's consulting with these organizations, but that's more like a late career move. And the pay at these places, I'm sure, is much higher, probably like 150K a year. All of this is in US dollars that I'm telling you. And but I don't hold me to that because I don't know the salaries in these places, but I'm sure they're like good enough. And in the nonprofit sector, maybe the salaries are not as high. Maybe you can compare them to the academic, like the university jobs. So say something like the World Bank or the IMF, or a think tank like Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., or Brookings, those places hire economists again for different purposes. They either it's to like World Bank has different research portfolios depending on your interests. So I would say those jobs are similar to the university jobs, where you again try to do research in that specific area and try to publish. So World Bank IMF jobs are similar to university jobs. And think tank jobs are also kind of similar in the sense that there is a specific area, like Urban Institute works on urban policy. There'll be like an environmental policy think tank, or there might be a health policy think tank. So you go into think tanks that you are sort of, your research is aligned with, and then you work in order to advise government or lobby for some kind of policies. And the pay, I would say, probably is comparable to university pay. And then in government jobs, they have specific job profiles. So at the Federal Reserve, they have specific economist positions where they expect you to work. You are essentially working for the government and doing data analysis for them. At the Federal Reserve, you're probably doing, I mean, I don't know anything about macroeconomics, but they do some kind of macroeconomic research at the Federal Reserve. And the education department hires. So these are very US specific jobs, obviously, that I'm talking about. But I'm sure, it's a similar situation in many other country governments, where different departments of the government hire you to work for them. And the pay there is also probably comparable to the university pay. So I would say the industry pay is the highest, and then everybody else is sort of comparable to each other.
Okay, and that's across countries.
I mean, developed countries, at least. Developing countries are more complicated, right? Like, I don't think the PhD to government pipeline is as well established, but certainly in like US and Europe, I would say this is the case, and even in Latin America.
So next, I'd like to just go on to our section regarding advice for aspiring researchers. Yeah, and what you can share based on your learnings and experiences so far. So one of the most important questions I had was regarding the skills or qualifications that one might need to become a researcher in the social science field.
Okay. I guess a sub question in this is what qualifications you need in order to get a PhD. That's one part of it. And then the other part is, suppose you don't want to do the whole thing of getting a PhD and going that route, then what are the options and what are the qualifications? So I'll answer the second part first, which is you could do a sort of, there are like a bunch of master's programs, right? There's a, I don't know, I mean, there are all these different universities that offer research masters in economics, or even in other social science fields, that give you quantitative skills, that give you a basic econometrics training, expose you to current research, so that prepares you to work in a non-profit research or in think tank research or even in industry research to some degree. And that I would say I don't know a lot about that line because I've been mostly focused on the PhD route to research. So I would say it's unclear what kind of master's program signal what ability in that field, because in some markets you might be competing with other PhDs, and then in some markets you are applying for jobs where the boss is going to be an econ PhD. So those are, I think, the two types of markets. And in some places they don't really care for a econ, like they don't care for a PhD in order to hire a researcher. They are happy with a person who has a master's. And because the job profile is such that, you know, it's more maybe policy based research or maybe more front end, like talking to policy makers about research, that kind of work, which, you know, the PhD doesn't really prepare you for, but a master's like an MPP or something might. So I mean, I think it's a tough question to answer, because I don't think it's as straightforward which degree can get you what job in that sense. And this market is ever changing, really. Like, I know that Harris expanded its MPP, like Masters of Public Policy program, from 200 to 500 in the last couple of years. So clearly there is an increasing demand for this kind of a job profile where you have some research skills and you want to enter the policy space and do like research adjacent work, but not really, you know, go this whole route of trying to publish papers, but more uh, like advising governments or advising companies, that kind of a thing. So I think that that is a volatile market at this point world over. And in order to sort of stand out in that market, really, I would say the most important thing, like this sounds really pessimistic, but it's true, that you just need to know people and you need to make contacts and like try, that's how you find jobs, really. Like, of course, getting a good degree and doing well in school is important, but you know, there'll be a lot of people who end up applying for master's programs, even in like the top schools in India. Say you go to say an ISB or a IGIDR or TISS or something like that. There will be a lot of people who do those master's programs, and there isn't like a centralized job market where you just apply and people evaluate you based on your CV and just hire you. That's really not how it works. You have to send out your CV to a ton of places. You need to talk to people you know from your past, like a career, and find out who is hiring. So mostly the way you find out that there are openings is because somebody you know told you that there's an opening in this job. So that's really the qualification you need is who you know, unfortunately. And I think that's to some extent even true in the PhD route, where I mean, I just told you that the way I got into Stanford is because I was at J-PAL working for this professor who told me that there was a job opening that I could apply to, right? So I think like the basic qualification requirement obviously is like, okay, do really well in undergrad, try to get the best grades you can. Then, you know, depending on the master's program you choose, or the you try to do as well in your masters as possible, impress your advisors and get them to write you good letters of recommendation, but also constantly be hustling and like try to find out who you know and who they know and what jobs are open. So, and then obviously, like once you have that information, then you apply, and then you talk to people who've applied, talk to people who've worked there before, and then get in. So it's a lot more fluid than one would think, even in academia. Like even after a PhD, when you're trying to get a job, a lot of it depends on, obviously depends on your research and the kind of research you did in your dissertation, but it also depends on who your advisors are and who they know and what kind of letter of recommendations you're going to get from them. And yeah, so it's, I mean, I hate to say it, but I think this is really how this market works, and I think any job market works. So you have to do well in your master's program or your PhD program, but that's not enough.
Yeah, networking as a skill to understand what it takes and how to
Yeah,
sort of get your foot in the door. Yeah,
correct.
yeah, that makes sense. And in terms of skills, is there anything that you would emphasize for a researcher who's working in the development sector?
Again, I think it depends on the kind of job you're looking at. If you're looking at a more policy focused job, then you need to have some understanding of basic econometrics and basic data analysis. And of course, you need to know how to use statistical software. But honestly, that's something, even if you don't know before the job, you can always pick it up really quickly. And you are sort of forced to learn it once you're in the job. So yeah, preparing for like R or something, that's always good. I would say just having a sound understanding of statistics is really important. I think if you want to be in a data driven position, and if you are obviously doing qualitative research, then I'm sure there are other requirements that I'm not equipped to answer. But what people use in, say, anthropology or something, they have their own ways of understanding qualitative data. So that's there. But in on the quant side, I would say you really need to like take a statistics 101 class online. I know that many people haven't studied stats in their undergrad, or they may have, but they've forgotten it. So really, like, having a good understanding of that will make you more comfortable with the data that you're working with, and the sort of results that you get when you're talking to policymakers in the space. And in order to apply for a PhD, I would say the skills are pretty much the same, but you need a lot more understanding of econometrics and math. If you want to apply for a PhD in econ or public policy, then you definitely need to have taken a decent amount of math classes. You need to take linear algebra, real analysis, econometrics. So yeah, and you need to have those technical skills, but you also need to, like I said earlier, you need to be able to like figure out how to contact the people you already know and ask them what they did. Like, there is this thing called informational interviews. Like, you can look this up and say how to do an informational interview. You basically go and ask somebody who you know who has a job that you think is interesting, and ask them what they did to get it, because it really varies by job. And knowing what the interviewer is expecting of you, it really helps. Like, before I applied to J-PAL, I talked to somebody who worked at J-PAL, and she told me that this is the things that they look for, this is what you should say. So in that information is really important. So um I would say that that's that's the other skill you need to have, is sort of reaching out to people and finding more information, apart from just the technical skills.
That's great. And given that you've been working in this role for a while before your PhD, what have been your biggest realizations or surprises that you think other students or somebody who's entering this field should know about?
I feel a lot of times people enter the field, especially like the development research space, with this mindset that this research is going to change the world. I mean, not in that naive way, but in a genuine way, like they want to do something that is going to help society. And I mean, maybe that is true, but that really can't be enough of a driver for you to do your everyday work. Like, in your everyday, I don't think you're going to feel like that you're changing the world, because you might be doing something that's very far removed from that ideal. Like, you might just be running a bunch of regressions or doing data analysis every day. Like, a lot of people who enter JPAL end up coming in thinking that they're going to do path breaking work, but actually the everyday of it is really not, like, you can't easily connect it to your big goal, I would say. So you need to find smaller things. Like, you need to enjoy the everyday process of doing research, as much as you enjoy the end goal of it, I would say. So you should think a bit about what the job profile is before you apply for these jobs. And again, like I can't emphasize more how much networks matter. Like it just that's just the truth, like I sound like a broken record, but I think in undergrad, when you're like starry-eyed and you're trying to get a job, like you think, oh my god, I have all these abilities and everything's going to be great, and it can be, but you really can't predict the path that your career is going to take. And so you can't freak out about what's your next step, because it all really comes down to like being in the right place at the right time. Obviously you have to be prepared for the job, but at the end of the day, it's like, okay, this person just happened to tell you about this job, and so you applied and it happened. Like most other people I know, that's how they are in the positions they are in. So I think it's a bit unfortunate and jarring once you get into the field and you realize this. And this is not just true of development, but in general, I think of this whole space. Like, yeah, sometimes you may be disadvantaged because you don't know the right people. And you should go in knowing that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I mean, the first part that you mentioned about, actually loving the day to day and not romanticizing the big goal is something that a lot of people have covered in past podcasts. And I think that becomes even more pertinent for a research job where you're not able to see things changing on ground at the pace that you would have ideally liked, because you're not involved in that stage of things, or probably that the timeline is just too long.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and beyond what you've already covered, do you have any other thoughts or words of advice for students and young professionals navigating the academic research space or overall development sector as well?
I guess in academic research, if you are an undergrad who is looking for advice, I would say try and get as much research experience in your undergrad itself. Like it may not be very cutting edge, or it may not be, the best thing that's out there, but like try to do research as an undergrad, because that's when you really find out if you enjoy it or not. And that can help you sort of figure out if this is the path for you. And if you're a person who's looking for jobs right now and isn't like has graduated and maybe is doing their masters and looking for jobs or something like that, then I would say I think research is it varies a lot by who who is doing the research and sort of like where you're doing it. Like I already said, in the university the agenda is sort of different, in the nonprofit it's different, in government it's different. So you need to figure out like what is it about the process that excites you. If for you it's just the research part of it is intellectually stimulating and you want to learn more about, just like advancing the body of knowledge, then you need that core belief in that to be able to continue on this path. If you don't feel like this is a very useful thing and you really want to be on the implementation side of things, and I know a lot of people get this feeling when they're on this path, that they think, oh, my research is not relevant, or what I'm doing at this organization isn't really impacting anybody. So I think that's a natural feeling to have. And for some people, it really is true. Like their skill set lies somewhere else and they thought this was the path they wanted to take, but this really isn't what they imagined it to be. And so you should stop and think about if you really believe that this is something that a mm, satisfies you on a career level or intellectual level, and b if you are cut out for this kind of work. And I mean, I feel like there is also this sort of thinking of, I don't know, there is this idea that if you do a PhD then you have to do academic research, or in or that the only way to be in the development field is through research or through implementation, like either of those two. So I don't know. I think you should just think hard about what your end goal is before getting into any of these jobs, and really think about what it is about research that's exciting for you. If it's only the end goal of it, then I would say, think twice before entering this field. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Devika, and thank you for the helpful primer into an academic research career, which I'm sure gives clarity to those who might not have had as much visibility into this career opportunity as a lot of others who are able to access this through their networks. So, thank you for being with us and all your really, really helpful answers.
Thanks, Mansa. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.